secrets of the vault. Ellie couldn't shake the image of the artifact resting on the altar. Even as they returned to the main vault chamber, her mind raced with questions about its purpose and the terrible power it seemed to hold. The whispers, the visions, and the oppressive energy of the place all pointed to one grim truth. The artifact had been at the heart of something ancient and horrific. Back in the relative safety of the research office, Ellie spread a series of documents, maps, and sketches across the table. Callum sat nearby, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee and casting occasional glances at the door, as though expecting the shadows themselves to come alive. This place was more than a vault, Ellie said, her voice tense. It was a prison. Callum frowned. A prison for what? Or who? Ellie pulled a brittle map from the pile and traced her finger along a set of faint markings that radiated outward from the vault. I found this in the archives weeks ago. It's a layout of the castle from the 14th century. Look, these passages aren't just storage areas or tunnels for escape. They lead to chambers specifically designed to contain people. Hundreds of them. Callum leaned forward, his skepticism giving way to unease. So what? This was some kind of dungeon? Ellie shook her head. Worse. I think it was used to quarantine plague victims during the Black Death. The plague shadow. Ellie's theory wasn't unfounded. During the 14th century, the bubonic plague had ravaged Europe, leaving death and despair in its wake. Cities had resorted to desperate measures to contain the spread, often locking the infected in their homes or abandoning entire villages. Edinburgh Castle, with its strategic location and fortified structure, had served as both a refuge and a containment site. But as Ellie dug deeper into historical records, she found accounts that hinted at a darker practice. These vaults were sealed off deliberately, Ellie said, pointing to a faded journal entry written by a castle steward in 1349. Listen to this. To protect the city, those marked by the sickness are sent below, their suffering hidden from the living. The stone shall keep them. Callum paled. You're saying they put people down there alive? Ellie nodded grimly. It wasn't uncommon. They didn't have the means to treat the plague, so they tried to contain it. Anyone suspected of infection was taken to the vaults and left to die. Left to die, Callum repeated, his voice hollow. That's monstrous. Ellie met his gaze, her expression serious. And now we're walking through their graves, uncovering the evidence. Determined to confirm her theory, Ellie returned to the vaults the following day, armed with tools for excavation and documentation. Callum reluctantly accompanied her, his earlier bravado replaced by a wary determination to see things through. The air in the vaults was colder than before, and the oppressive silence seemed to press against their ears. As Ellie examined the walls more closely, she began to notice subtle details she'd overlooked during their initial exploration. These carvings, she said, running her fingers over a series of faint etchings on the stone. They're not decorative. They're markings. Callum peered over her shoulder. Markings for what? Count the lines, Ellie said. He frowned, his flashlight beam illuminating the grooves. There are dozens, maybe hundreds. Exactly, Ellie replied. Each one represents a person. These aren't carvings. They're tally marks. Callum stepped back, his stomach churning. You mean they were counting the dead? Ellie nodded. Or the days they survived. Further along the corridor, Ellie discovered a pile of debris that appeared to be blocking a smaller passage. With Callum's help, she cleared the rubble, revealing a narrow doorway that led into a small, enclosed chamber. The room was lined with niches carved into the walls, each one containing a bundle of rags or bones. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as she realized what she was seeing. This was their final resting place, she said softly, the voices of the past. As Ellie and Callum documented the chamber, the whispers returned. Faint at first, like a distant breeze, they grew louder as the pair worked. Callum froze, his pen hovering over his notebook. Do you hear that? Ellie nodded, her heart pounding. The whispers seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, their cadence rhythmic and mournful. Though the words were indistinct, their tone conveyed an overwhelming sense of sorrow and despair. Ellie set down her tools and closed her eyes, trying to focus on the sound. The whispers seemed to carry emotions more than language, grief, anger, and a deep, abiding fear. "They're still here," Ellie said, her voice trembling. "Who?" Callum asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. "The plague victims. Their spirits never left." Callum's flashlight flickered, and the air grew colder. A faint mist began to rise from the floor, swirling around their feet like a living thing. "Ellie," Callum said, his voice tight, "we need to go. Now." But Ellie was transfixed. She knelt beside one of the niches, her fingers brushing against the fragile remnants of cloth and bone. As she did, a vision flickered across her mind, fleeting and fragmented but vivid. A vision of despair. Ellie saw the vaults as they had been centuries ago, filled with the sick and dying. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the faint lamplight cast grotesque shadows on the walls. The people were huddled together, their faces pale and gaunt. Some cried out for mercy, while others sat in resigned silence, their eyes hollow. A child clung to her mother's side, her small frame racked with shivers. Above them, the soldiers sealed the entrance, their faces grim as they bricked the doorway shut. The sound of the final stone being set into place echoed through the chamber, followed by a heavy silence. Ellie gasped, the vision fading as quickly as it had come. She looked at Callum, her face pale. "They were trapped," she said, her voice trembling. "They begged for help, but no one came." Callum swallowed hard, his own fear mirrored in her expression. "We need to leave," he said. "This place isn't safe." The stone's secret. As they prepared to leave, Ellie's gaze was drawn once more to the artifact. It seemed to pulse faintly, as though reacting to their presence. "Ellie," Callum warned, his voice tight. "Don't." But Ellie couldn't resist. She reached for the artifact, her fingers brushing its surface. The whisper swelled, filling her mind with fragments of words and images. She saw the plague victims again, but this time their forms were spectral, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They reached out to her, their mouths moving in silent pleas. One word rose above the chaos, clear and insistent: release. Ellie stumbled back, her chest heaving. "They want to be free," she said. "Free?" Callum asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "Ellie, they're dead. They're trapped," Ellie insisted. "The vaults, the artifact, they're bound together. Whatever this thing is, it's keeping them here." Callum shook his head. "And what happens if we destroy it? What if it unleashes something worse?" Ellie didn't have an answer. All she knew was that the plague victims had been imprisoned in these vaults, their suffering woven into the castle's history. The artifact was the key to their freedom, but it was also the source of their torment. The decision weighed heavily on her as they made their way back to the surface, the whispers following them like a mournful chorus. Haunted by shadows, the underground chambers felt alive. The walls, cold and slick with moisture, seemed to pulse faintly, as if the castle itself were breathing. Ellie's flashlight cut through the oppressive darkness, illuminating ancient carvings and scattered debris. Behind her, Callum's footsteps echoed hesitantly, each sound a reminder of how deeply they had ventured into the unknown. "What are we even looking for?" Callum asked, his voice barely masking his unease. "Answers," Ellie replied, her gaze fixed ahead. "These chambers are tied to everything. The artifact, the plague victims, the curse. If we can understand their connection, maybe we can stop whatever's happening." Callum shook his head, his flashlight darting nervously from side to side. "You say stop, but what if we make it worse?" Ellie didn't respond. The truth was, she wasn't sure, but she couldn't turn back now. The air grew colder the deeper they ventured, and with it came an eerie sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails raking against stone. "Did you hear that?" Callum whispered, stopping in his tracks. Ellie nodded, her grip tightening on her flashlight. "Stay close," she said, her voice steady despite the chill that crept along her spine. The first scream, the tapping grew louder as they moved forward, accompanied by a faint rustling sound, like dry leaves scraping against the ground. Ellie's pulse quickened as she scanned the corridor ahead, her flashlight trembling slightly in her grip. Then it came, a piercing scream that echoed through the chamber, cutting through the silence like a blade. Ellie froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound was raw and filled with agony, as though someone were being torn apart. Callum stumbled back, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," Ellie said, her voice trembling. "But we're not alone down here." The scream subsided, replaced by a heavy silence that felt even more oppressive than the sound. Ellie forced herself to move forward, her steps cautious and deliberate. As they rounded a corner, the beam of Ellie's flashlight fell on something that made her stomach churn. A shadowy figure stood at the end of the corridor, its form indistinct but unmistakably human. "Ellie," Callum whispered, his voice shaking. "Do you see that?" She nodded, unable to tear her eyes away. The figure didn't move, its silhouette flickering like a candle flame. Ellie took a step forward, and the figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving only the faint sound of whispering in its wake. The Hall of Echoes. The corridor opened into a vast chamber, its walls lined with niches filled with crumbling bones and decayed cloth. Ellie shone her flashlight across the room, the beam catching glimpses of hollow eye sockets and skeletal hands. The air was thick with the smell of earth and decay, and the whispers grew louder, their cadence uneven and disorienting. "Do you feel that?" Ellie asked, her voice barely audible. Callum nodded, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "It's like the room's alive." Ellie stepped cautiously into the chamber, her boots crunching against the loose gravel on the floor. As she moved closer to the center of the room, the whispers shifted, becoming distinct words in a language she couldn't understand. "Ellie," Callum said, his voice urgent. She turned to see him backing away, his flashlight trained on the far wall. Shadowy figures moved along its surface, their forms twisting and writhing like smoke. "They're everywhere," he whispered, his face pale. Ellie followed his gaze, her heart pounding. The shadows seemed to multiply, spilling from the walls and stretching toward the floor. Their movements were erratic, their forms human-like but distorted, as if trapped in a liminal state. The surge of fear. A second scream tore through the chamber, louder and more agonized than the first. Ellie flinched, her flashlight beam flickering as she stumbled back. The sound seemed to trigger something in the room. The shadows surged forward, coalescing into a mass of writhing figures that moved with unnatural speed. "Run!" Ellie shouted, grabbing Callum's arm. They sprinted toward the opposite end of the chamber, their flashlights bouncing wildly as the shadows closed in. Ellie felt a cold hand graze her shoulder and nearly lost her footing, the sensation sending a wave of terror through her. The whispers grew deafening, merging into a cacophony of voices that echoed off the walls. Ellie couldn't understand the words, but their tone was unmistakable, accusatory, angry, and filled with sorrow. "Don't look back," she yelled, her voice barely audible over the noise. Callum didn't need to be told twice. The sealed room. They burst into another corridor, their breaths ragged and their hearts racing. The whispers faded slightly, but the oppressive weight of the air remained, pressing down on them like an invisible force. Ellie stopped to catch her breath, leaning against the cold stone wall. "What the hell is happening?" Callum demanded, his voice trembling. "The spirits," Ellie said, her chest heaving. "They're tied to this place. They're angry. They're trapped." Callum shook his head. "Trapped? You think they want us to free them?" Ellie didn't answer. Her attention was drawn to a heavy wooden door at the end of the corridor. It was partially ajar, the edges blackened as though it had been scorched by fire. Without waiting for Callum's protest, Ellie moved toward the door, her flashlight cutting through the darkness beyond. The room was small and circular, its walls lined with more niches. In the center of the floor lay a circular stone slab, its surface etched with strange symbols that pulsed faintly in the darkness. "This is it," Ellie said, her voice filled with awe. "This is where it happened." Callum stepped cautiously into the room, his flashlight illuminating the symbols. "What happened here?" Ellie knelt beside the slab, her fingers tracing the carvings. "This is where they sealed the plague victims. They used the artifact to bind them here, to keep the sickness and the spirits from escaping. A ghostly confrontation. As Ellie spoke, the air grew colder, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than before. The shadows coalesced in the doorway, blocking their escape. Ellie and Callum stood frozen as a figure emerged from the darkness. It was a woman, her translucent form flickering like a dying flame. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow, and her hands outstretched as if pleading for help. "Please," the woman whispered, her voice filled with despair. Ellie felt a lump rise in her throat. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling. The woman's form flickered, her expression twisting into one of anger. "Release," she hissed. "Release us." The whisper swelled, and the shadows pressed closer, their forms writhing with rage and sorrow. Ellie clutched the artifact in her hand, its surface pulsing with faint warmth. "We can help you," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. The woman's face softened, and she nodded slowly before dissolving into the darkness. The shadows retreated slightly, leaving Ellie and Callum standing alone in the room. A choice to make. Ellie looked down at the artifact, its symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. She knew what had to be done, but the risks were terrifying. "If we release them, there's no telling what will happen," Callum said, his voice filled with dread. Ellie nodded. "But if we leave them here, they'll never rest." The decision weighed heavily on her as she knelt beside the slab, the whispers surrounding her like a chorus of ghosts. She placed the artifact on the slab, her heart pounding as the symbols flared to life. The ground trembled, and the room filled with light, the spirit's anguished cries giving way to a single, resounding word. "Freedom!" A collapse beneath the castle. The glowing symbols on the slab pulsed brighter with each passing second, casting eerie patterns on the chamber's rough stone walls. The air hummed with energy, a low vibration that made the hairs on Ellie's arms stand on end. The artifact, now nestled in the center of the slab, seemed to draw power from the vault itself, and the whispers surrounding them reached a deafening crescendo. Callum took a step back, his flashlight trembling in his grip. "Ellie, whatever's happening, we need to stop it." Ellie shook her head, her eyes fixed on the artifact. "It's too late. I think this is what the spirits wanted." The slab began to tremble, its surface glowing with an intensity that forced Ellie and Callum to shield their eyes. The ground beneath them groaned like a living creature, and a deep, resounding crack echoed through the chamber. Ellie's stomach twisted. The vibrations were growing stronger, and the stone walls around them began to shudder. "We need to move," Ellie shouted, the first signs of collapse. Callum didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed Ellie's arm and pulled her toward the doorway, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they ran. Behind them, the artifact emitted a final, blinding flash of light, and the floor buckled with a deafening roar. Chunks of stone rained down from the ceiling, crashing to the ground in clouds of dust and debris. The once solid walls cracked and splintered, sending jagged fragments tumbling into the narrow corridor ahead. Ellie stumbled as the ground shifted beneath her, her boots skidding on loose gravel. Callum caught her arm, yanking her upright as a massive chunk of ceiling crashed to the floor behind them, blocking the path to the chamber. "Faster!" Callum yelled, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. Ellie's lungs burned as she sprinted after him, her flashlight beam flickering as dust filled the air. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, its twisting passages illuminated only by the faint glow of their flashlights. Another tremor shook the ground, and Ellie threw herself against the wall as a section of the ceiling collapsed inches from her feet. "This whole place is coming down," Callum shouted, his voice panicked. A race against time. As they pushed forward, Ellie's mind raced. The artifact's activation had triggered the collapse, but why? Was it the spirits finally breaking free from their prison? Or was it the castle itself, rejecting their intrusion? The whispers were gone now, replaced by the deafening roar of falling stone and the groaning of ancient walls under immense pressure. Ellie felt the weight of centuries pressing down on her as she navigated the crumbling corridor. "Do you know where you're going?" Callum called out, his flashlight illuminating a fork in the path ahead. Ellie hesitated, her mind struggling to remember the layout of the vaults. "Left," she shouted, hoping her instincts were correct. They turned down the left passage, the air growing colder and the ground more uneven. Ellie's flashlight caught glimpses of jagged carvings and crumbling bones, remnants of the vault's grim history. The ground shook violently, and Ellie barely managed to keep her footing as another section of the ceiling collapsed behind them. "We're not going to make it," Callum muttered, his voice thick with fear. "We will," Ellie said, though her own voice wavered. A dead end. Ellie skidded to a stop as the corridor ended abruptly in a wall of rubble. Her heart sank as she realized their path was blocked. The ceiling above them caved in completely. Callum let out a string of curses, pacing in front of the blockage. "This is it. We're trapped." Ellie's mind raced, her eyes scanning the walls for another way out. The tremors were growing stronger, and the cracks in the walls were spreading, sending more dust and debris into the air. "There has to be another way," she said, more to herself than to Callum. Her flashlight caught a faint glimmer of metal near the floor, a rusted iron grate partially obscured by debris. Ellie dropped to her knees, her hands clawing at the rubble to reveal a narrow opening. "Here," she shouted. "It leads somewhere." Callum crouched beside her, his flashlight revealing a small, dark tunnel beyond the grate. "Are you kidding me? That's barely big enough to crawl through." "It's better than staying here," Ellie said, already prying at the rusted bars. The crawl space. With Callum's help, Ellie managed to pull the grate free, the metal groaning in protest before giving way. The tunnel beyond was pitch black and barely wide enough for them to squeeze through. Ellie went first, her flashlight held in her teeth as she crawled on her hands and knees. The air was stifling, filled with the acrid smell of dust and decay. She could hear Callum's labored breathing behind her, his flashlight flickering as he followed. The tunnel seemed endless, its walls pressing close on either side. Ellie's knees scraped against the rough stone floor, and her shoulders ached from the confined space. "Are you sure this goes somewhere?" Callum asked, his voice echoing in the narrow passage. "I don't know," Ellie admitted, "but we don't have a choice." The tunnel began to slope upward, and Ellie's heart lifted slightly. They were ascending, moving closer to the surface. The final push. The tremors grew fainter as they crawled, the roar of collapsing stone replaced by an eerie silence. Ellie's flashlight beam caught glimpses of ancient markings on the walls, symbols similar to those on the artifact and the altar. "What is this place?" Callum murmured, his voice hushed. "A way out," Ellie said, though she wasn't entirely convinced. At last, the tunnel opened into a small chamber, its walls covered in faded carvings. A narrow staircase led upward, its steps worn smooth by centuries of use. Ellie scrambled to her feet, her legs trembling with relief. "Come on," she said, gesturing to Callum. The staircase spiraled upward, the air growing fresher with each step. Ellie's heart raced as she climbed, the faint glow of daylight visible at the top. When they emerged into the open air, Ellie collapsed onto the ground, her chest heaving. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the castle grounds. Callum sank down beside her, his face pale and streaked with dirt. "We made it," he said, his voice thick with disbelief. Ellie nodded, her gaze drifting back toward the castle. But at what cost? The weight of survival. As they sat in silence, the faint sound of drumming echoed through the air, soft, steady, and mournful. Ellie's chest tightened as she realized what it meant. The spirits of the vaults were free, but the curse of the artifact had only just begun. "We can't leave it like this," Ellie said, her voice filled with determination. Callum turned to her, his expression incredulous. "You're not seriously thinking of going back?" Ellie's gaze hardened. "If we don't, this isn't over. The castle, the spirits, whatever's happening here, it'll only get worse." Callum sighed, rubbing his temples. "You're insane." "Maybe," Ellie said, standing and brushing the dirt from her clothes. "But I'm not giving up." The castle loomed behind them, its dark silhouette a reminder of the secrets still hidden within its walls. Ellie knew the vaults held answers, but they also held danger. Danger she was determined to face.